Marcus stood at the back of the training ground, watching other recruits practice their sword techniques with perfect form. His own sword felt heavy in his hands and sweat dripped down his face despite the cool morning air. The other young men moved like dancers, their blades cutting through the air with precision and grace. Marcus stumbled over his own feet and nearly dropped his weapon. "Pathetic," muttered Sergeant Kane, the chief training officer. His voice carried across the yard, making several recruits turn to look at Marcus. "How did someone like you even get accepted into the Royal Guard training program?" Marcus had been asking himself the same question for weeks. His father had been a simple blacksmith in a small village outside the capital. When the royal recruiters came looking for young men to join the elite Royal Guard, they had chosen Marcus along with sons of nobles and decorated soldiers. He still didn't understand why. The written examination had been a disaster. Marcus could barely read the complex military strategy questions. While other candidates finished their papers with confidence, he sat staring at words that seemed to swim on the page. Mathematics had never been his strong point, and the tactical problems might as well have been written in a foreign language. Physical training was even worse. Running in formation left him gasping for breath while others barely broke a sweat. The obstacle course defeated him every single time. Climbing walls, jumping over barriers, crawling under nets, everything seemed designed to humiliate him. Other recruits would finish the course and then watch him struggle through it, shaking their heads in disbelief. Weapons training brought no relief. Swords, spears, bows, Marcus failed with all of them. His arrows missed targets by wide margins. His spear work was clumsy and dangerous to those around him. Even basic defensive positions confused him. The training masters would demonstrate a technique once, and while others picked it up immediately, Marcus needed dozens of repetitions and still got it wrong. "You're hopeless, village boy," sneered Willem, son of a famous general. "Why don't you go back to hammering iron with your father? At least there you might be useful." The other noble-born recruits laughed. Marcus said nothing, as he had learned to do. Fighting back would only make things worse. Instead, he focused on trying to improve, even though improvement seemed impossible. Every day brought new failures, new embarrassments, new reasons to question why he was there. But Marcus had something the others didn't notice. He paid attention to everything around him. While they focused on their own performance, he watched how the servants moved through the training grounds, how the guards positioned themselves around the perimeter, how the officers communicated with subtle gestures. He noticed when someone was sick before they knew it themselves, when equipment was about to break, when weather would turn bad. The other recruits saw his constant observation as another sign of his inadequacy. They thought he was distracted, unfocused, not serious about training. What they didn't understand was that Marcus was learning, just not in the way they expected. His mind worked differently, absorbing details that others considered unimportant. After another particularly humiliating day of failed tests, Marcus sat alone in his bunk, wondering if he should quit. The smart thing would be to leave before the final evaluations, before his failures became official record. He could return to his village, help his father in the smithy, live a simple life without constant disappointment. But something kept him there. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the memory of his mother's face when the recruiters chose him. She had been so proud, so certain that her son was destined for something greater. He couldn't bear the thought of crushing that faith, even if staying meant enduring more humiliation. The other recruits had already begun making plans for their future positions in the Royal Guard. They talked about which units they hoped to join, which officers they wanted to serve under, what their first assignments might be. Marcus listened to these conversations knowing he would never be part of them. His future lay elsewhere, though he couldn't imagine where. As he lay in his narrow bed that night listening to the snores of his fellow recruits, Marcus made a decision. He would stay until the end, no matter how badly he performed. He would face every test, endure every failure, and accept whatever judgment came. If nothing else, he would prove that a blacksmith's son could show up and try, even when trying seemed pointless. The final evaluation week arrived like a storm that everyone could see coming, but no one could avoid. Marcus watched his fellow recruits prepare with a mixture of excitement and confidence that he envied. They sharpened their weapons, reviewed their tactical manuals, and discussed strategy with the easy assurance of young men who had never truly failed at anything important. Marcus spent the time differently. He cleaned his equipment carefully, knowing it wouldn't improve his performance but unable to stop himself from trying. His sword gleamed, his armor was spotless, his boots were polished to a mirror shine. If he was going to fail spectacularly, at least he would look professional doing it. The first test was combat simulation. Each recruit had to face 3 opponents in succession, demonstrating various fighting techniques. Marcus watched from the sidelines as Willem danced through his matches, his sword work elegant and deadly. The crowd of observers murmured approval as each noble-born recruit displayed their skills. When Marcus's name was called, the murmuring stopped. An uncomfortable silence fell over the gathering. Even the training masters looked embarrassed for him. He stepped into the fighting circle, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. His first opponent was a junior instructor who was clearly trying to make the match look respectable. The man telegraphed his moves, gave Marcus obvious openings, and generally fought like he was teaching a child. Despite this kindness, Marcus barely managed to avoid complete humiliation. His sword work was clumsy, his footwork awkward, his defensive positions weak. He lasted longer than anyone expected, but only because his opponent was essentially letting him. The second and third matches were worse. By the end, Marcus was exhausted, bruised, and covered in sweat. The other recruits avoided looking at him directly, embarrassed by proxy for his performance. Sergeant Kane made notes on his clipboard with the expression of a man documenting a disaster. The tactical assessment came next. Recruits were presented with battle scenarios and asked to devise strategies. Marcus stared at the maps and unit markers, understanding the individual pieces but unable to see how they fit together into a coherent plan, while others confidently moved pieces around, explaining their reasoning with military terminology. Marcus struggled to form even basic ideas. His presentation was a rambling mess of half-formed thoughts and obvious mistakes. The evaluating officers listened with painful politeness, occasionally asking gentle questions that only highlighted his confusion. When he finished, the silence that followed felt like a physical weight. Physical testing continued the pattern. Marcus failed the endurance run, finishing dead last and requiring medical attention. His marksmanship scores were so poor they had to check if something was wrong with his equipment. The obstacle course defeated him as completely as it had every other time he attempted it, but something strange began to happen during the evaluation week. While Marcus was failing every official test, he started noticing things that others missed. During the combat simulations, he observed that one of the training masters favored his left leg, suggesting an old injury that could be exploited. He noticed patterns in how different opponents moved, weaknesses in their techniques that even they weren't aware of. During tactical exercises, while he couldn't devise winning strategies himself, he could see flaws in the plans others presented. He watched one highly praised strategy and realized it left the supply lines completely vulnerable. He saw another plan that would work perfectly in good weather, but would collapse if it rained. The most telling moment came during a group exercise where recruits had to work together to solve a complex scenario. While the natural leaders emerged and began organizing the group, Marcus found himself watching the evaluators instead of participating. He noticed which officers were paying attention to which aspects of performance they valued, what they wrote down, and what they ignored. None of this helped his own scores, of course. If anything, his distraction made his performance even worse. But he was learning things that weren't being tested, developing insights that weren't being measured. The written examinations were Marcus's final chance to prove himself, and they went exactly as expected. Military history, tactical theory, logistics, leadership principles, every subject found him wanting. He handed in papers that were half blank, filled with answers he knew were wrong, marked by obvious gaps in knowledge that years of study couldn't have filled. As the evaluation week ended, Marcus felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. The ordeal was over, but the results were inevitable. He had failed every test, disappointed every instructor, and embarrassed himself in front of everyone who mattered. Soon he would receive his dismissal notice and could begin the long journey back to his village. The other recruits were already celebrating, confident in their success. They made plans to meet after their assignments were announced, promised to stay in touch as their careers developed, and speculated about which of them might rise highest in the ranks. Marcus listened to these conversations with a kind of detached interest, like someone watching a play about people whose lives had nothing to do with his own. What he didn't know was that his constant observation hadn't gone as unnoticed as he thought. Field Marshal Catherine Blackwood had been watching the recruits for weeks, though none of them knew it. As the kingdom's highest-ranking military officer, she made it her business to observe each training class personally, looking for qualities that written tests and combat scores couldn't measure. She had built her reputation on finding potential where others saw only problems. The field marshal had earned her position through 25 years of military service, rising from a common soldier to the kingdom's most trusted military advisor. She understood better than anyone that the qualities that made someone successful in training weren't always the same qualities that made them valuable in real service. Books could teach strategy, but they couldn't teach instinct. Drills could build muscle memory, but they couldn't build character. She had been particularly intrigued by Marcus from the beginning. Not because of his performance, which was indeed terrible by every conventional measure, but because of his behavior. While other recruits focused intensely on their own advancement, Marcus seemed to be studying everything and everyone around him. She watched him notice things that experienced soldiers missed, absorb information that others considered irrelevant, and demonstrate an awareness of his environment that was almost supernatural. During one training exercise, she had observed Marcus quietly warn another recruit that his armor strap was about to break, preventing what could have been a serious injury. The other recruit barely acknowledged the help, too focused on his own performance to appreciate what had just happened. But the field marshal noticed. She saw him detect illness in a stable boy days before anyone else, simply by observing the way the young man moved. She watched him predict weather changes by reading signs that the official forecasters missed. Most remarkably, she observed him understand the political dynamics between different groups of recruits, officers, and support staff without anyone teaching him about such things. These observations led Field Marshal Blackwood to conduct an experiment. She began appearing at training sessions more frequently, but always in positions where she could watch Marcus without being noticed. She wanted to see if his awareness extended to recognizing threats and opportunities that others missed. What she discovered fascinated her. Marcus had an almost uncanny ability to sense when situations were about to change. He would tense up moments before accidents happened, move away from areas where conflicts would break out, and position himself to help when someone was about to need assistance. It was as if he could read the subtle signs that preceded events, seeing patterns that others missed entirely. The field marshal had seen this quality before, but only in a handful of exceptional soldiers during her long career. It was the mark of someone who could keep a unit safe, who could sense ambushes before they were sprung, who could read the flow of battle and position themselves where they would be most valuable. It was a quality that couldn't be taught and couldn't be tested, but it was worth more than perfect sword work or flawless tactical knowledge. During the final evaluation week, Field Marshal Blackwood paid special attention to how Marcus handled failure. She watched him endure humiliation with dignity, continue trying despite repeated defeats, and maintain his focus on learning even when learning seemed pointless. She saw him help other recruits with small problems even though they treated him as an embarrassment. Most importantly, she observed that his unique awareness never wavered even under stress. After the formal evaluations concluded, the field marshal made an unusual decision. Instead of simply reviewing the test scores and making assignments, she scheduled individual meetings with each recruit. This wasn't standard procedure, but her rank gave her the authority to handle assignments however she saw fit. The successful recruits met with her confidently, expecting praise and good assignments. She was polite but brief with most of them, asking a few questions about their goals and preferences before dismissing them with promises that their assignments would be announced soon. Marcus was scheduled for the last meeting. He entered her office expecting nothing more than a formal dismissal, perhaps with some kind words about effort and character to soften the blow. He had never spoken directly with the field marshal before, and her reputation was intimidating even under the best circumstances. "Sit down, Marcus," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. Her office was spare but impressive, decorated with maps of the kingdom and weapons from various campaigns. The late afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, casting everything in golden light. Marcus sat carefully, trying not to show how nervous he was. The field marshal studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She was a woman in her 50s, with gray streaks in her dark hair and scars that spoke of real combat experience. Her eyes were sharp and calculating, the eyes of someone who had seen too much to be fooled by appearances. "I've been watching you," she said finally, her voice calm but serious. "Your test scores are the worst in the history of this program. Your combat skills are laughable. Your knowledge of military theory is virtually non-existent." Marcus nodded, unsure how to respond. Everything she said was true, and they both knew it. "However," the field marshal continued, "you have something that most of your classmates lack entirely. You see things, you understand situations, you anticipate problems. These are not qualities we test for, but they may be the most valuable qualities a soldier can possess." Marcus looked up, confusion clear in his expression. He had no idea where this conversation was heading. The field marshal leaned back in her chair, studying Marcus with the same intensity she might use to examine a battle map. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sounds of the training ground outside. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, still uncertain whether this was an elaborate prelude to his dismissal. "Tell me what you observed during Willem's final combat test," she said suddenly. The question caught Marcus off guard. Willem had performed brilliantly, earning praise from all the instructors. "He fought well," Marcus said carefully. "His technique was perfect. I didn't ask about his technique. I asked what you observed." Marcus hesitated, unsure if this was some kind of trap. The field marshal waited patiently, her expression revealing nothing. Finally, he decided that honesty couldn't make his situation any worse. His left shoulder dropped slightly before he attacks, Marcus said slowly. "Not enough for most people to notice, but it telegraphs his intentions. And he favors spectacular moves over practical ones. In a real fight against someone who knew what to look for, those habits could be exploited." The field marshal nodded slightly. "What else?" "He was performing for the audience," Marcus continued, gaining confidence. "Every move was designed to look impressive rather than to be effective. He's skilled enough that it worked, but it showed he was thinking more about how he appeared than about actually winning the fight." "And during the tactical exercises?" Marcus thought back to the complex scenarios they had been given. Most of the strategies were textbook perfect, but they assumed everything would go according to plan. In real battle, things go wrong. Supply lines get cut, weather changes, messages don't get through. The best plans were the ones that could adapt when the unexpected happened. The field marshal leaned forward, her eyes sharpening with interest. "You failed that exercise?" "Yes," Marcus admitted. "I couldn't devise a good strategy myself, but I could see which ones would work and which ones wouldn't." "Explain." For the next hour, the field marshal questioned Marcus about everything he had observed during training. Not his own performance, but what he had seen in others. She asked about the instructor's teaching methods, the dynamics between different groups of recruits, the effectiveness of various training techniques, and dozens of other details that Marcus had noticed but never thought to mention. With each answer, Marcus grew more confident. This was something he could do, something he was actually good at. While he couldn't perform the techniques himself, he could see patterns and connections that others missed. He could predict how people would behave, anticipate when systems would fail, and understand the subtle currents that flowed beneath the surface of every situation. The field marshal made notes as he talked, occasionally asking follow-up questions that pushed him to explain his reasoning. Marcus found himself describing insights he hadn't even realized he possessed, connections his mind had made without his conscious awareness. "You mentioned that Instructor Davies has been favoring his right side during demonstrations," she said at one point. "How long have you noticed this?" "About 3 weeks," Marcus replied. "It started gradually, so gradually that I don't think he's aware of it himself. But it's getting worse. I think he has an injury that isn't healing properly." The field marshal made another note. "And you observed this while failing to master any of the techniques he was teaching?" Marcus flushed slightly. "Yes, I know it doesn't make sense. On the contrary, it makes perfect sense. You were learning, just not what everyone expected you to learn." She set down her pen and looked at him directly. "Marcus, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. If you could have any position in the military, what would you choose?" Marcus blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I never thought I would have a choice. You have one now. What would you want to do?" Marcus considered the question seriously. All his life, he had assumed that his role would be determined by his limitations rather than his preferences. The idea of choosing seemed foreign, almost impossible to grasp. "I want to be useful," he said finally. "I want to help keep people safe. I don't care about glory or advancement or proving anything to anyone. I just want to matter somehow." The field marshal smiled for the first time since the conversation began. "That," she said, "is exactly the right answer." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the training grounds where the next class of recruits would soon begin their own struggles. Most soldiers want to be heroes. They dream of leading charges, winning battles, earning medals, and recognition. There's nothing wrong with ambition, but it can blind people to what really matters. She turned back to face Marcus. "What really matters is keeping the kingdom safe. Not the dramatic gestures that get written about in history books, but the small observations that prevent disasters, the quiet insights that save lives, the unglamorous work of understanding what's really happening beneath the surface." Marcus listened intently, beginning to sense that this conversation was leading somewhere he had never imagined. "I have a position that needs filling," the field marshal continued. "It's not glamorous. You won't lead troops into battle or earn fame for your achievements. Most people will never know your name or understand what you do, but it's one of the most important positions in the Royal Guard, and I believe you're uniquely qualified for it." She returned to her desk and picked up a document that had been lying face down. "This is your assignment if you're willing to accept it. You'll report directly to me, and your duties will be classified at the highest level. Are you interested?" Marcus stared at the document in the field marshal's hands, unable to process what was happening. After weeks of failure and humiliation, after accepting that his military career was over before it began, he was being offered an assignment. Not just any assignment, but one that came directly from the kingdom's highest-ranking military officer. "I don't understand," he said honestly. "How can someone who failed every test be qualified for an important position?" The field marshal set the document on her desk but kept her hand on it. "Let me tell you a story. 20 years ago, I was commanding a garrison on the northern border. We had intelligence suggesting that enemy forces were planning an attack, but all our scouts reported normal activity. Everything looked peaceful." She paused, remembering. "I had a young soldier, barely 18, who came to me with concerns. He couldn't point to anything specific, but he insisted something felt wrong. His instincts were telling him that an attack was imminent, even though all the evidence suggested otherwise." Marcus listened intently, sensing the importance of what he was hearing. "I ignored him," the field marshal continued, her voice carrying the weight of regret. "He had no formal intelligence training, no experience reading enemy movements, no credentials that would justify overriding our professional scouts. He was just a common soldier with a feeling." She looked directly at Marcus. 3 days later, we were hit by a surprise attack that nearly overran our position. The enemy had used routes that our scouts hadn't even considered, moved at times when our surveillance was lightest, and exploited weaknesses in our defenses that we didn't know existed. If I had listened to that young soldier, if I had trusted his instincts over conventional wisdom, dozens of good people would still be alive today." The weight of her words settled over the room. Marcus began to understand what she was telling him, though it still seemed impossible to believe. "That soldier had the same quality you have," she said, "the ability to sense patterns that others miss, to feel when situations are developing in ways that conventional analysis can't detect. It's not magic and it's not luck. It's a form of intelligence that we don't fully understand but can't afford to ignore." She picked up the document again. "I've spent years trying to find another soldier with that same gift. I've tested hundreds of candidates, looked for that quality in every recruit who passed through our programs. You're the first person I've found who has it in the same measure." Marcus felt overwhelmed. The idea that his constant observation and strange insights could be valuable, even crucial, challenged everything he believed about himself. "But what would I actually do? You would be my personal intelligence analyst," the field marshal explained. "You would observe situations that concern the security of the kingdom and provide me with your assessments. Not formal reports based on established procedures, but honest evaluations of what you see and feel." She began pacing slowly around the room. "There are threats to our kingdom that don't announce themselves through traditional channels. Political conspiracies that hide behind legitimate activities. Military preparations that disguise themselves as peaceful exercises. Social tensions that build gradually until they explode into violence. These threats can only be detected by someone who can read the subtle signs that precede them. Marcus tried to imagine himself in such a role. It seemed both terrifying and exciting. Would I work alone? Mostly, yes. You would attend court functions, military briefings, diplomatic meetings, and other gatherings where important people discuss important matters. To everyone else, you would appear to be a simple guard, perhaps even an incompetent one. Your job would be to observe and understand what you see. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. His failures in training would actually serve as camouflage for his real duties. People would underestimate him, ignore him, speak freely in his presence because they wouldn't consider him a threat. There would be risks, the field marshal continued. If anyone discovered your true role, you would become a target. And the psychological pressure of constantly watching for threats, of carrying the responsibility for the kingdom's security, has broken other agents in the past. Marcus thought about this soberly. He had spent his whole life being underestimated and overlooked. The idea of turning that disadvantage into a strength appealed to him, but he understood the dangers involved. "Why are you trusting me with this?" he asked. "You barely know me." "I know enough," she replied firmly. "I've watched you handle failure with dignity, treat others with kindness even when they mocked you, and continue learning even when learning seemed pointless. Those are the qualities I need in someone who will have access to the kingdom's most sensitive information." She returned to her desk and sat down. "But the choice is yours. I can assign you to a regular guard position if you prefer. You'll struggle with the conventional duties, but you'll have a simple, straightforward military career. Or you can accept this assignment and step into a role that few people could handle." Marcus looked at the document on her desk, knowing that his answer would determine the entire course of his life. The safe choice was obvious. Take the regular assignment, do his best to improve at conventional soldiering, and live with the knowledge that he would always be mediocre at his job. But the field marshal was offering him something he had never dared to hope for: a chance to be truly useful, to matter in ways that went beyond personal success or failure. It was an opportunity to serve the kingdom using the very qualities that had made him seem like a failure in training. "If I accept," he said slowly, "when would I start?" 3 months later, Marcus stood in the great hall of the royal palace, wearing the simple uniform of a common guard. To everyone around him, he appeared to be nothing more than another face in the background, one of dozens of guards who provided security for court functions. Nobody looked at him twice, nobody remembered his name, and nobody suspected that he reported directly to the field marshal herself. The transformation had been remarkable, though not in ways that anyone could see. Marcus still couldn't fight particularly well, still struggled with complex military procedures, and still made mistakes that more experienced guards would never make. But none of that mattered anymore because his real job was to watch and understand, not to perform conventional military duties. Tonight's gathering was particularly important. The kingdom's nobles had assembled to discuss trade agreements with neighboring countries, but Marcus's trained eye caught undercurrents that the official proceedings couldn't reveal. He watched body language, listened to conversations between formal speeches, and noticed who spoke to whom during breaks in the ceremony. Lord Pemberton, the kingdom's chief trade negotiator, was nervous about something beyond the normal stress of diplomatic negotiations. Marcus had observed him at several previous functions, and tonight his behavior was different. The man kept glancing toward a group of foreign delegates, but not in the way of someone conducting normal business. There was fear in those glances and something that looked like guilt. More telling were the small conversations happening at the edges of the great hall. Marcus had positioned himself where he could observe these interactions without appearing to pay attention. Several nobles were having quiet discussions that stopped abruptly whenever someone else approached. The pattern suggested coordination, planning, perhaps even conspiracy. Most intriguing was the behavior of Sir Edmund, a minor noble whose family had fallen on hard times recently. Marcus had noticed him at court more frequently over the past month, despite his reduced circumstances. Tonight, Sir Edmund was carrying himself with a confidence that seemed out of place for someone in his position. He spoke to foreign delegates with a familiarity that suggested previous contact that hadn't been arranged through official channels. As the evening progressed, Marcus began to piece together a troubling picture. The trade negotiations everyone was focused on might be cover for something more sinister. Several financially desperate nobles seemed to be coordinating with foreign representatives. possibly selling information or influence that could compromise the kingdom's security. He made mental notes of everything he observed, knowing that he would need to provide a detailed report to the field marshal the next morning. This was exactly the kind of situation his unique abilities were meant to detect. A threat hiding behind legitimate activities, visible only to someone who could read the subtle signs that preceded betrayal. The next morning, Marcus met with Field Marshal Blackwood in her private office. She listened intently as he described his observations, asking pointed questions that helped him organize his insights into a coherent assessment. "Your instincts were correct," she said when he finished. "We've been monitoring Lord Pemberton for weeks, suspecting he might be involved in something inappropriate. Your observations confirm our suspicions and provide new leads we hadn't considered." She made notes as they talked, planning the next steps in what was obviously a complex investigation. "Sir Edmund is particularly interesting. We hadn't identified him as a potential security risk, but your description of his behavior suggests we should look more closely at his recent activities." Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction that his work was proving valuable. Over the past 3 months, his reports had helped identify several potential threats to the kingdom, from minor security breaches to major intelligence concerns. Each success built his confidence and confirmed that the field marshal had been right about his unique abilities. "There's something else," the field marshal said, setting down her pen and looking at him directly. "The king has requested a briefing on your work. He's heard about the intelligence you provided, and he wants to meet the agent who's been supplying such valuable insights." Marcus felt a moment of panic. Meeting the king was an honor beyond anything he had imagined, but it also represented a level of responsibility that terrified him. "What should I tell him?" "The truth," she replied simply. "Tell him what you see, what you understand, and what concerns you about the security of his kingdom. He values honest assessment over diplomatic courtesy." As Marcus left the field marshal's office, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. 6 months ago, he had been a failed recruit facing dismissal from military service. Today, he was providing intelligence briefings that would reach the king himself. The journey from failure to success hadn't followed any path he could have predicted, but it had led him to exactly where he belonged. The other recruits from his training class had been assigned to various guard units throughout the kingdom. They served honorably in conventional roles, protecting important locations and people according to established procedures. Marcus respected their service, but he understood now that his path had always been different. That afternoon, as he prepared for another court function where he would blend into the background and observe the hidden currents of power and intrigue, Marcus thought about the words the field marshal had spoken months ago. She had been right about everything. The most important work often happened in the shadows, performed by people whose names would never appear in history books but whose insights could save kingdoms. As he adjusted his simple guard uniform and prepared to become invisible once again, Marcus smiled slightly. He had found his place in the world not despite his apparent failures, but because of the unique perspective they had given him. Sometimes the most valuable soldiers were the ones nobody expected to succeed, and sometimes the greatest service came from being willing to fail at everything except the one thing that truly mattered.